In the world of high-stakes private equity, the most dangerous thing a woman could be was competent enough to be indispensable and forgettable enough to be overlooked. Simone Adler had spent 4 years perfecting both. She wasn't the kind of woman who walked into a room and changed its temperature. She knew that. She'd made peace with it somewhere around her 28th birthday, when she'd finally stopped waiting for someone to notice that the firm's entire risk assessment framework ran through her hands before it ever reached a partner's desk. Nobody noticed. That was the point. That was, in fact, the strategy. Whitmore Capital occupied the 42nd through 45th floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, where the air smelled like money and ambition and the particular kind of desperation that men in $3,000 suits called drive. Simone worked on 43, in an office barely large enough to hold her desk, her 3 monitors, and the stack of bound reports she generated every week that somehow always appeared on the partners' tables without anyone wondering how they got there. She was 31 years old. She had a master's degree in financial mathematics from Columbia and a gift for pattern recognition that had, on 2 separate occasions, saved the firm from catastrophic losses that nobody but her had seen coming. She wore dark cardigans and sensible shoes, and kept her natural hair pulled back in a way that her mother called professional and her college roommate called camouflage. She was, by every measurable standard, one of the most valuable people in that building. She was also the woman that Dorian Ashford, managing partner and the kind of man who made rooms go quiet when he entered them, had looked through for nearly 4 years without once actually seeing her. She'd counted. Not because she was keeping score, because she was the kind of woman who noticed patterns, and Dorian Ashford not seeing her had become the most consistent pattern in her professional life. He was 38, 6'2", with the dark, controlled presence that came from being born into old money and then doubling it on his own terms. His family had founded Whitmore 3 generations back. He'd taken the helm at 34 and turned a respected legacy firm into something genuinely feared on Wall Street. He was relentless and precise and occasionally ruthless in the way that men who'd never had to apologize for taking up space often were. He drank his coffee black, kept his schedule in his head, and had never once in 4 years asked Simone Adler her opinion on anything. Which was why, on the Tuesday morning in late November, when he stopped in the doorway of her office and said, "The Hargrove model. You built that. It wasn't a question." Simone didn't look up from her screen right away. She assumed he was talking to someone behind her. There was no one behind her. She looked up. Dorian Ashford was leaning against her doorframe with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a copy of the Hargrove risk assessment, her work unmarked by her name, and looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not quite curiosity, something sharper than that. "Yes," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the report, then back at her. "The leverage flag on page 31, the one that caught the secondary exposure in the Cayman structure. Yes? Nobody else saw that?" "No," she agreed. They didn't. He was quiet again. Then he walked into her office without being invited, pulled the chair from the corner, sat down across from her desk, and said, "Walk me through how you found it." That was how it started. For the next 6 weeks, it continued in small, careful increments that Simone told herself meant nothing. He started stopping by her office. Not often. Dorian Ashford didn't do anything that could be described as often unless it served a deliberate purpose, but regularly enough that her colleagues noticed and said nothing to her face and everything to each other, she was certain. He started putting her name on the internal memos. Small thing, enormous thing. She'd spent 4 years watching other people's names on the work her hands had built. He was not warm. She didn't expect warm. He was precise and demanding and occasionally said things with the bluntness of a man who had genuinely never learned that delivery mattered, like the time he reviewed her restructuring proposal and said, "This is the clearest thinking I've seen in this building in 2 years," without any preamble, without any softening, as though he were stating the weather. She'd had to look back at her screen so he wouldn't see the expression on her face. She was not falling for him. She was clear about that with herself. She was 31 and smart enough to know the difference between being seen by a powerful man and being valued by one. And she had spent enough of her 20s confusing the two to know better now. This was professional. This was her work finally getting the recognition it deserved through the only channel that could actually deliver it in a firm like this one. That was what she told herself. She told herself that all the way through December, through the late evenings when the floor emptied, and they were sometimes the last two people in the building, talking through models and projections, and occasionally, in the unguarded minutes when the conversation drifted, other things. He told her about the firm's history, about his grandfather who'd built it, and his father who'd nearly lost it, and him who'd clawed it back. She told him about growing up in Cincinnati with a mother who'd worked 2 jobs and still found time to quiz her on math on the car ride to school. He listened the way he did everything, completely without distraction, in a way that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like the most important thing in the room. She was absolutely not falling for him. Then came the December 15th evening, when a winter storm blew into Manhattan with the kind of violence the forecast had dramatically underplayed, and by 7 p.m. the subway was suspended, and the streets were a study in gridlock and ice, and Dorian Ashford appeared in her doorway, in his coat with his car keys in his hand, and said, "I'll drive you. You don't know where I live," she said. "Brooklyn, I know where you live." He said it without embarrassment, like knowing where his employees lived was simply information he possessed. "The bridge will be slow, but it'll be open. Come on." She should have said no. She said yes, because it was 17 degrees outside and she was wearing inadequate shoes, which was the story she told herself in the car when the heat was running and the city moved past the windows in blurred yellow lights. And Dorian drove in silence that was somehow not uncomfortable, and she caught herself watching his hands on the wheel and looked away and watched the city instead. He pulled up in front of her building and didn't move to unlock the doors, just sat there for a moment with the engine running. "I need you on the Alderman acquisition," he said, "not as support, as lead analyst. Your name on the materials, you'd be working directly with me." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the street ahead, jaw set, and she had the sudden, strange conviction that this was not the first time he'd thought about saying this. "Why now?" she asked. He turned then, looked at her in the particular way he had, direct, no performance, no management of what his face was doing, "because I should have done it 2 years ago, and I was wrong not to." That was all he said. She got out of the car in the snow and went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in her coat for a long time without taking it off. January arrived cold and relentless, and the Alderman acquisition consumed everything. Simone worked 18-hour days and discovered that working with Dorian, rather than invisibly beneath him, was an entirely different experience. Demanding and exhilarating, and occasionally aggravating in the specific way that being pushed by someone who actually believed you capable of more was aggravating. He challenged her assumptions out loud. He argued with her models, and was twice proven wrong, and acknowledged it each time with the same flat precision he applied to everything, which she found against her better judgment, more attractive than any practiced charm could have been. She was aware that she had a problem. She was also aware that it was too late. She didn't know when it had happened. Somewhere between the risk model and the car ride and the late nights, and the way he looked at her across conference tables, like she was the only person in the room who was saying anything worth hearing. It had happened quietly, the way the most inconvenient things always do. Not in a moment she could point to, but in an accumulation of moments she'd tried to reframe as professional until she'd run out of ways to reframe them. She was careful. She was always careful. She gave nothing away at work, maintained every boundary, acted like the competent and collected professional she absolutely was. She went home and was less collected, and her best friend Tamara listened on the phone and said things like, "Simone, baby, you work too much. And, of course, you caught feelings. You've been alone in a building with him for 3 months. And please, for the love of God, stop calling it professional regard." Then came the Friday night in February when the alderman deal closed at 11 p.m. with champagne that someone produced from somewhere, and the team spilled out into the conference room, and everyone was exhausted and relieved and loud, and at some point the room thinned, and she was standing at the window, with her second glass of champagne looking at the city, and Dorian appeared beside her. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there. "Good work," he said finally, which, from him she had learned, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "We did good work," she said. "Don't do that." His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Don't minimize your contribution to make me comfortable. I hate that." She looked at him. He was looking at the city, glass in his hand, and something in the set of his face was different from how he looked in the office. Something that made her pulse do something she was not interested in acknowledging. "Okay," she said. "I did good work. You did exceptional work." He turned then, and the look on his face was the same one from that first day in her doorway, something sharper than curiosity, sharper and more deliberate. "Simone, don't," she said, quietly, evenly. He didn't say anything. "Don't," she said again, "because I need this job and I'm good and I've worked too hard to make it complicated. I'm not trying to make it complicated." "Dorian," she said his name for the first time without any professional prefix and watched something shift in his face. "I know what I look like. I know what you look like. I know how this story goes. The man who looks like you doesn't." She stopped herself, looked back at the window. "I'm not doing this." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, "What do you think you look like?" She didn't answer. "Because I'll tell you what I see," he said. "I see the person who saved this firm 2 years ago and didn't get credit for it. I see someone who works longer and thinks faster and sees further than anyone else on that floor. I see someone who just closed the most complex deal this firm has done in a decade. And I see someone who just told me what she thinks I think of her, and was wrong." "She still, look at me," he said she did. "I've been wrong about a lot of things in the last 4 years," he said. "Being wrong about you was the most expensive mistake I made, and I don't spend." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, very quietly, "You're asking a lot." "I know," he said, and he looked like he meant it. She went home that night and did not call Tamara. She sat in her apartment with the lights dim and thought about what it meant to be 31 and smart enough to have protected herself for so long that she'd nearly made herself impossible to reach. She thought about the particular loneliness of being capable, the way competence became its own kind of wall, the way you could make yourself so functionally indispensable that no one ever thought to ask if you were okay. She also thought about the way Dorian Ashford had said, "I see someone who was wrong about what I think of her," with the exact same directness he used to deliver earnings projections, like it was simply a fact he was correcting, and she'd started to understand that this was for him the highest form of sincerity he had. She went to work Monday morning and said nothing. Let him say nothing. Let the week pass. On Thursday, he stopped in her doorway again. The same doorway, the same posture, jacket off, sleeves rolled, and said, "Dinner, Friday." Not a command, he said, immediately. A question with a preference. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, steady, patient, which was, she'd come to understand, not a thing Dorian Ashford was with everyone. "Friday," she said, 7. 3 months later, she was standing in her bathroom at 6 in the morning with a pregnancy test in her hand and the particular stillness of a person whose entire internal landscape has just shifted on its axis. She sat down on the edge of the tub. She'd been careful. They'd both been careful. She was 31, not 22, and she understood consequences. And yet, she sat there for a long time. Her first thought, and she was not proud of this, but she was honest enough to admit it, was not about the pregnancy. It was about the conversation she was going to have with Dorian Ashford and all the ways it might go wrong. They had been careful about everything, about the office and the optics and the power dynamics, and she had never once let herself be in a position where she needed something from him. She had never wanted to need something from him. She put the test in the bottom of her bag and went to work. She made it 4 days before. The 4 days became 6, and the 6 became a week and a half, and she still hadn't said anything. And by then the not saying had taken on a weight of its own, a separate thing she was carrying around in addition to everything else. And Tamara said on the phone, "Simone, what is wrong with you? You tell people things." And Simone said, "I'm telling you." And Tamara said, "That does not count." She told herself she was protecting herself. From what exactly she couldn't articulate clearly. From the look on his face if he was relieved. From the look on his face if he wasn't. From the possibility that this would change what they were in a way that revealed it had always been more fragile than it felt. What she was actually doing, and she knew this, was the same thing she'd done for 4 years. Making herself invisible rather than risk being seen and found wanting. She was better than that. She told herself she was better than that until she believed it. She found him in his office at 8 p.m. on a Thursday, the floor almost empty, the city dark and brilliant outside his windows. He looked up when she appeared in his doorway. He always noticed her immediately now, in the way that still caught her off guard, like a reflex that had rewired itself. And something in her face must have said something, because he set down what he was reading immediately. "Close the door," he said. She closed it, stayed near it. He didn't tell her to sit down, and she didn't. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He nodded. "I'm pregnant." She said it the way she said everything that scared her, cleanly, almost 2 weeks ago. "I didn't tell you right away, and that wasn't fair, and I'm telling you now. I don't have expectations, and I'm not asking for anything. She stopped, steadied herself. "You deserve to know." The silence lasted long enough that she had time to regret exactly one more thing. Then Dorian Ashford stood up from behind his desk. He crossed the office in about 4 strides, stopped directly in front of her, and looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. Something that was the opposite of what she'd feared. Something that was, if she was reading it correctly, a man arriving at a decision he'd already made before she finished the sentence. 2 weeks, he said. "Yes, you carried this for 2 weeks alone." "Ah, yes." Why? Not accusatory, genuinely asking. The way he asked everything. She looked at him. "Because I was scared." "Of what?" "Of needing something from you." She said it out loud for the first time, and it landed between them with a weight she hadn't anticipated. "I've never needed anything from anyone in this building. I built my entire career on not needing anything." And then, she gestured, vaguely, at the space between them. "And then this." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You thought I'd make you feel small. It wasn't a question, and it was exactly right." "Yes," she said. He reached out and put his hand along her jaw, tilted her face up, deliberate, careful, asking, and looked at her the way he had that night at the window, except more, everything more. "Simone." He said her name the way he said nothing else. "I'm going to say this once, and I need you to hear it. The last 4 years of not seeing you were the most expensive mistake of my professional life. I don't intend to spend the next 4 years making the personal equivalent." His thumb moved along her cheekbone. "You are not alone in this. You were not alone before this. I need you to understand that." She didn't trust her voice. Nodded. "Okay," he said, quietly. Simply, like it was settled. "Dorian, I know this is complicated." He dropped his hand, gave her room but didn't step back. "The firm, the optics, the timing. I know, we'll handle it properly. Together." He paused. "But I need you to stop disappearing on me. Every time you get scared, you go invisible. I've watched you do it for 4 years. I'm asking you to stop." She exhaled. Something in her chest, something she'd been holding without fully acknowledging, she was holding it. Released. "You noticed that," she said. "I notice everything about you," he said. "I just started too late." February became March, its spring that arrived in New York with the aggressive optimism it always did. Like the city had personally decided to turn a page. Simone's life rearranged itself in ways she hadn't planned and found herself, for the most part, not afraid of. She was 14 weeks when Dorian stood up in the Monday partners meeting and said, in the same flat, factual tone he used for quarterly projections, that he and Simone Adler were together and that she was being named Senior Director of Risk Strategy effective immediately, and that anyone who had a problem with either piece of information could schedule time with him directly. The room was very quiet. Then Garrett Whitmore, 81 years old, Dorian's great-uncle, the last of the founding generation, who had never in Simone's memory said more than 15 words to her, looked across the table and said, "Took you long enough, boy," and went back to his notes. Simone, who had been sitting in that meeting for the first time at the partners' table, with her name on the placard, and her report in front of everyone and Dorian's hand steady at her back when he'd walked her in, felt something loosen behind her sternum that she hadn't known was clenched. After the meeting in the hallway, she stopped walking and turned to face him. "I had a whole speech," she said, "about how I didn't need you to announce it for me, about how I was going to handle it myself." "I know," he said. "You didn't give me the chance." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He looked at her steadily. Was I wrong? She thought about 4 years of her name on no memos. She thought about being the furniture. She thought about the way it had felt, sitting in that room with her name on a placard and his hand at her back, not like she needed him to open the door. She could open her own doors, had been opening them for years, but like she hadn't had to open it alone. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong." He nodded once. Then, because he was Dorian Ashford, and he had never once in his life been demonstrative in public, he put 2 fingers under her chin, tilted her face up, and kissed her briefly and deliberately in the hallway of Whitmore Capital on the 43rd floor, where anyone could see. Then he handed her the folder she'd left in the conference room and said, "You have a call at 11. Don't be late," and walked away toward the elevator. She stood there for a moment in the hallway. Then she laughed. Really laughed, the surprised, full-body kind that she hadn't expected, and went to her office. Her office, with her name on the door, which had been there since Monday morning, which Dorian had apparently arranged on Friday without telling her. She'd noticed and said nothing. He'd noticed her noticing and said nothing. She was beginning to understand how they were going to be. 2 people who noticed everything, saying the important things out loud and understanding the rest in the silence between. Simone Adler sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, pulled up the 11 o'clock call, and got to work. She was not invisible. She had never needed to be. She'd just been waiting for herself to believe it.